Hi, I'm Keegan Smith, and this is Crash Course US History, and today we're going to be looking at pop culture in the 20th century, everything that preceded Kim Kardashian, Hobo Clothes by Yeezy. Mr. Smith, why the 20th century? Hasn't popular culture been around for, ever? I'm glad you asked me for the past, but first, let's define pop culture. Pop culture is that loose blend of books, music, and fashion, and other daily ephemera that define a society at a particular point in time. In essence, pop culture is a self-portrait created through purchasing power. So why the 20th century? Well, throughout American history, there has been a norm for cultural preferences and activities. But it wasn't until the early 20th century, during the Progressive Era, did pop culture arise. This era allowed for the creation of 8-hour workdays, and with it leisure time that had previously been unknown to the general public. But inventions like radio broadcasting in 1906 and the television in 1925 were crucial pop culture later in history. Rebecca, why don't you tell them a little bit more about it?
Thanks, Keegan. The proliferation of public broadcasting and television permitted further diffusion of popular broadcasting in the future to come. Between 1925 and 1950, the United States' perception of popular culture changed as a result of the Great Depression, World War II, and the Second Great Migration, which led to a collection of freshly published creative works and a shifted view of the American identity. After all, there's nothing like warfare and poverty to motivate change to this society, if you know what I mean. The Great Depression sent families into a whirlwind of conservation, desperation, and resourceful thinking. Families once comfortable in their traditional ways of life were forced to rethink the necessity of popular luxury goods and remake the construction of the home. People became more conservative in their purchasing patterns, reusing and fixing objects as possible. Recipes developed which required no or limited amounts of butter and dairy, and stretched limited rations of meat to meet the needs of now struggling middle class. Newly developed systems of polling and surveying the citizens showed a growing unification, despite the competitive nature of the job market, and political discontent. Franklin D. Roosevelt referenced this in his inaugural address, citing the change in the moral climate of America. The American way of life became a well-known concept that was frequently referenced in the media. Speaking of the media, photojournalism also became increasingly popular during that era, in part thanks to the newly improved cameras and technology, and with the publication of Life magazine in 1936. Feelings of failure among citizens led to the creation of comic books, such as Superman and Batman in 1938 and 1939. The new comic books fueled the imagination of the coming generation, enforcing ideals of gender and strong heroism. Other creative genres developed alongside, including the rise of Disney, with the release of Mickey Mouse in 1928, and the movie Gone with the Wind and the novel Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939. Folk singers such as Woody Guthrie changed the music industry and set a precedent for folk culture. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, men were sent to the front lines, shifting the focus of the industrial economy, lifting the United States out of the Great Depression, and forcing women to fill the roles of men outside the home. Propaganda became widespread, motivating enthusiasm for the war effort and a rise in patriotism in American hearts. Women took up roles in the military, particularly in nursing, and many filled jobs outside the home to meet the financial needs of their families and the demands of the war economy. Reflected in the changes of the depiction of women in the media. The once depicted as fragile, genteel lady became more frequently referenced as capable, such as the infamous Rosie the Riveter. What, Shannon? It's time for the mystery document? The rules are simple. I read the mystery document and try and guess what it is. If I get it right, yay me. If not, I get sprayed like a dog. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing until the watcher turns his eyes away. In resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. So, during this era, it doesn't seem... It's definitely siding to the fulfillment of men's desires when it comes to nautical explorations. And they capitalized watchers, so I feel like that'd be God, like God's watching. Let's just go with the feminine mystique. Okay. So what actually is it? The eyes are watching God, of all things. So speaking of the Harlem Renaissance, As men went to fight, leaving manufacturing jobs open, Southern-born African Americans moved north in what is known as the Second Great Migration, fleeing the oppressive culture of the South. The growth of black neighborhoods, such as the infamous Harlem, led to the development of a distinct collection of black literature. African American writers became sought out by publishers for their realistic depictions of black culture and fed white writers with their exotic texts, such as those of Langston Hughes. Now, on to the 50s!
Thanks, Rebecca. So, welcome to the third part of the 20th century. The years of polio, racism, communist paranoia, and of course, rock and roll. Crispy, can we have a libertage right about now?
America.
In the years after World War II, the American population exploded. In 1946, there were 9,345 babies being born each day. By 1954, there were over 11,000 babies being born each day. In the peak year of the boom, 1957, over 4 million babies were born in 1 year. This was the prelude to the next 20 years of incredible social and economic change. Yes, there were so many other things happening in the political sphere of America at this time, but let's try to avoid that for a minute and just look at the pure growth of popular culture as previously defined by Keegan. The 50s saw the rise of the civil rights movement, but picketing and bus boycotts were not the only ways that the flames of change were being fed. American sports like football and baseball were becoming a stage for the tedious yet powerful changes in the integration and rights for African Americans. In the late 40s, Jackie Robinson was a household name, despite his apparently inferior race. Good job, America. By 1960, the total had become 52 African Americans, which is about 15% of the national roster. But things were changing. Now, the 1950s, more than any of the 4 decades to come, was characterized by complete widespread popular culture. If something became popular, everyone jumped on the bandwagon. Poodle skirts and leather jackets were all the rage, and everyone wanted to be a part of this new, freer style. Coincidentally, Barbie was invented in 1959. Yay! Hashtag unrealistic beauty standards since 1959. And hey, while we're at it, why don't we reaffirm traditional male standards with Tonka trucks and Tinker toys? Movies and television captivated national audiences. Every girl wanted to be Marilyn Monroe, and every guy, including President Kennedy, wanted to be with her. Thanks. Stop. Anyways, 60 million people were going to movies every week. Especially the ones where you drive into the theater? What? Then why do they call it a drive-in? Anyways, I Love Lucy and Western shows were also really popular. And so was driving around in foreign cars. And the mass uniformity of the American people was the new norm. But things were changing. Let's go to the thought bubble. So with this uniformity grew several norms. Women who had seen the freedom of work and independence when men were fighting in World War II were back to being faithful housewives. This was the revitalization of the term coined the cult of domesticity. Women were stuck. They thought they were alone in their struggles. In 1963, Betty Friedan wrote the book The Feminine Mystique. Popular culture, in the form of books like this, directly challenged this frustration and helped spark the feminist movement that would peak in the next 2 decades. Thanks to the invention and widespread use of things like vacuum cleaners, washing machines, Cool Whip, and TV dinners, women were able to go to work and get out of the house instead of managing it. But latchkey kids have their own rebellious manner, and of course, as we know, this generation would have a lot of rebellion. Along with the latchkey generation of the late 1950s, the baby boomer generation were now in their teens, and they didn't find the 1950s pop culture around them to their liking, so they were actively changing things. Current events like the Vietnam War, the feminist movement, and the civil rights movement were causing lots of change in the popular culture sphere. Things like vegetarianism, the birth control pill, and peace signs were becoming very popular. Everything was a revolution, and it showed in popular culture. Books like To Kill a Mockingbird and The Valley of the Dolls reflected the current social struggles of their time and became cult classics. Hippies, beatniks, and revolutionaries themselves were finding new ways to be heard. We can't talk about the 50s and 60s without talking about the British invasion and Elvis. The 50s and 60s saw a great change in music that caused a huge change in the counterculture of America. The scandalous thing called rock and roll became the definition of a generation.
The last quarter of the 20th century was vital in defining the concept of popular culture in the terms that we understand it today. It set the stage for popular culture most directly going forward because of the permanence of new media. The radio and the television were no longer regarded as extreme luxuries, but rather common household items. This meant increasing interconnectedness and communication among most of the American population. Popular culture was becoming more popular than ever before. The 70s was a decade that really marked a turning point for media, converting it into an inescapable frenzy that presented itself virtually everywhere. The 70s was the decade of the blockbusters. Classics such as Jaws, Star Wars, The Exorcist, and Carrie premiered all in the 1970s. The 70s had also marked yet another evolution of popular music, specifically that of disco. Hit it! Okay, that's enough. Seriously, you guys, stop it, please. Even more alarming than the music of the 70s was the fashion trends, which were one of its most notable cultural staples, largely due again to mass media. Bell-bottoms, tie-dye, feathered hair, clogs, mood rings. I guess that one could say that the 70s had abused its popular culture powers, but this was only the beginning because, of course, America loves turning fun concepts into big-haired, shoulder-padded messes. Which brings us to the 80s. One of the most important things to note about popular culture trends during this decade is that it was largely due to the effects of capitalism that was running more rampant than ever before. The 80s summed up was just a lot of consumption of things that nobody really needed. Think slap bracelets, jelly bracelets, and choking hazards. Lots and lots of choking hazards. Media of the 80s also had attacked an issue that had existed in the US since forever, which was sexism. However, the 80s did so in a way that was less feminism than it was girl power. What's the difference, you ask? Well, while feminism usually fights for the all-around equality of the sexes, girl power doesn't really fight for anything at all. Rather, girl power just usually says that it didn't really want equality, but rather that being a girl was okay because it was a glamorous existence. Best exemplifying this well-meaning but ineffective type of female empowerment were kids' television shows such as Jem and the Holograms. Now, let's get one thing straight. I love me some Jem. However, she was far from your modern feminist icon. She was making a career for herself, which was great, but she did so by singing about her rocky relationship with her boyfriend, Rio Pacheco, and wearing a crap ton of pink. She also wasn't the most intelligent role model. For example, the theme song of her show included the lyrics, "Jem is truly outrageous. Truly, truly, truly outrageous." You know what's truly, truly, truly outrageous, Jem? The damn wage gap. Jem is truly outrageous. Truly, truly, truly outrageous. By the way, if you haven't watched Jem and the Holograms yet, you really should. It's about a woman named Jerrica Benton who lives a double life as a rock star by changing her physical appearance. Sound familiar, Hannah Montana? I hate you. The 80s wasn't entirely materialism, though, and it faced some pretty pressing issues during the time. For one, drug use was at an astonishingly high rate. And the popularity of drug use during the 1980s can be compared to that of the 1960s. However, the drug of choice was cocaine as opposed to hallucinogens. More importantly, however, was the fact that during this time an HIV/AIDS epidemic plagued the United States. Keith Haring, an extremely popular artist during the 1980s and someone whose work you've probably seen at least once, had a piece called Silence Equals Death, which addressed the problem of AIDS. He was an advocate for fighting it, and unfortunately he died of the disease in 1990. Less directly, and unfortunately more commonly, the AIDS problem of the 1980s led to increased homophobia because of the fact that gay men were more likely to have unprotected sex and in turn contract the disease. The results in popular culture were largely negative. Finally, I would like to end with the 90s. This decade has largely been characterized by the emergence of rap music, which had survived long after. Although we can synthesize the style of rap music during the 1990s to that of today's, I think that it's pretty clear that lyrically it has changed a lot. I got broads in Atlanta. During the 90s, the founders of the rap music and the hip-hop style were predominantly, but not limited to, African-American males. The music was much different in the sense that it was presented like spoken word poetry and often characterized by some important message. These messages were often regarding the struggles of being an African-American in the United States. The Police by NWA addressed the issue of police brutality in a vulgar yet effective way. It just warms my heart.
Teen angst also ran rampant in the 1990s, and the grunge/goth style was unfortunately very popular. Smells Like Teen Spirit, anyone? This overall rebellious against authority attitude was very liberating. The type of carefree life promoted in the 1990s can be compared to that of the flapper lifestyle in the 1920s. Although this attitude had predominated most of the early 1990s, the second half of the decade had reverted back to the material ways of the 1980s. Amongst the overconsumed products of the 90s was the seizure-inducing works of Lisa Frank. This was Miss Boyle's binder when she was younger. By the way, it's like a bad acid trip, but I can't look away. As we near the end of the decade, overproduced teeny bopper music appears as well. In the final year of the 90s, something amazing happened. Britney Spears released her hit, Baby One More Time. It was a miracle. All of a sudden, the economy was fixed. Everyone's skin cleared up. All was right in the world. Okay, maybe not, but it's still a good song, and a great way to wrap up a ludicrous centennial of popular culture.
The events we have discussed today not only impact the hipster youth who yearn for a better era, but the world in which we live in. If it wasn't for the innovative spirit of the American people, where would global society be? Every song, every poem, every funky dance in the 20th century has gotten us here. Thanks for watching. I'm glad you asked me from the past, but first... to the...
Alright,
Okay.
thank you, Keegan.
Bush did 9/11.
Fresh cold wind of con.
Go.
Oh, hold on, I wasn't ready.
Why are my feet so sticky?
Broadcasting and television permitted further diffusion of popular
Can you try?
poetry, such as the poetry of Langston Houston.
Any of the 4 decades to come was defined by this characterized.
Go.
No. The flames of change were being fed. Hashtag.
Hit it.
What are you doing?
What is this?
Okay, go. An AIDS epidemic.
Bananas are the real killer.
Okay.
The banana cake.
Are you good?
The banana cake you ate.
No? You good?
No. I can't. I'm so tired.
I've been recording all of it. Alright, we're good. Let's go.
Okay.
Alright. Alright, take 3.
More importantly, however, was the fact that an HIV/AIDS epidemic was going on during this time. Keith Haring, an extremely popular artist during the 1980s, and someone whose work you've probably seen at least one time in your life, was an advocate.
Keegan! That was so good. That was.